A landlord evicted a poor family. Then karma hit hard. On a late summer afternoon, the sun glared down on the quiet streets of Brookside, a small suburban town just far enough from the city to feel insulated from urban bustle. Rows of modest single-story houses lined its streets, each with small front yards enclosed by weather-beaten fences. Children's bikes lay sprawled in driveways and overhead. A few clouds lazily drifted through the sky's haze. On warm weekends, families liked to gather for cookouts and yard sales, forging a sense of tight-knit community that felt almost nostalgic in an age of busy highways and towering apartment blocks. Brookside was home to many who lived on the edge of financial comfort. They didn't flaunt wealth. Most got by on paychecks from warehouse jobs, customer service shifts, or small local businesses. They valued neighborly ties, and though some folks struggled with rent, families often pitched in for one another. On Maplewood Lane, near a turn where the asphalt cracked with age, there was a modest duplex painted a dull off-white. The paint flaked in places, revealing older layers beneath. A narrow porch ran along the front, sagging slightly at the steps. For years, the property had been owned by a local man named Howard Dawson, but after Howard's passing, it transitioned to his nephew, a businessman named Neil Dawson. Neil was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with thinning hair styled neatly. Though not from Brookside originally, he'd grown up in a different part of the county and eventually delved into real estate, accumulating small rental properties. He cared little for the community's warmth or struggles. He viewed real estate purely as an investment. The Maplewood Lane duplex represented an opportunity for him. The building, along with several others he'd recently inherited from Howard, was worth more than the old rent suggested. From day one, Neil saw the place as a potential gold mine if he could raise rent or flip it for profit. His approach to management was coldly practical, guided by a simple mantra: pay up or get out. If that meant pushing out existing tenants in favor of higher-paying ones, so be it. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he believed business was business. He'd rather have a vacant unit for a month than tolerate late rent. He rarely visited the properties in person, delegating repairs to a local handyman at minimal cost. The only time he showed personal interest was if rent checks bounced or if he smelled an opportunity to profit by evicting and renovating. In the Maplewood Lane duplex left unit lived the Morrow family, a mother named Charlotte, her husband Ethan, and 2 kids, 9-year-old Katie and 6-year-old Thomas. They'd resided there for 5 years, originally under old Howard's easygoing ownership. Howard, though absent-minded and sometimes behind on repairs, had always been compassionate about rent. He understood folks in Brookside struggled. If the Morrows were a few days late, he'd extend a friendly handshake and say, "Just let me know when you can, Charlotte," trusting they'd pay as soon as possible. The Morrows never took advantage, always eventually getting him the money. Life was tough for them, but they managed. Charlotte worked as a part-time nurse's aide at a nearby assisted living facility, while Ethan took jobs as a handyman wherever he could, painting, minor construction, yard work, whatever paid. Between them, they scraped together just enough to cover rent, groceries, and the basic needs of the kids. Katie attended the local elementary, bright and curious, while shy Thomas was starting first grade. They owned little in terms of savings or extravagances. A battered second-hand car and a small TV set were among their more prized possessions. In quiet moments, Charlotte and Ethan confided in each other their dream of one day buying a small house, but they recognized it might remain just a dream. When Neil Dawson showed up in Brookside to claim his inheritance, the Morrows were initially oblivious. They only learned of the change in ownership when the next month's rent statement arrived with new letterhead: Dawson Properties. The monthly rent was increased by $100, accompanied by a note saying, "All future rent to be paid on the 1st, strictly enforced. Late fees apply after the 3rd." The letter was terse. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. They already struggled to meet the old rent. But after a tense conversation, she and Ethan decided to do their best, cutting corners on groceries and picking up extra hours where possible. The alternative was uncertain. Finding another unit might be even harder in a tight market. Weeks passed, and the Morrow kids returned to school after summer break. Charlotte juggled extra shifts at the assisted living facility, sometimes returning home exhausted, her feet sore from standing all day. Ethan also found a streak of short-term painting gigs. They managed to scrape up the increased rent for 2 months. Yet in the third month, a crisis struck. The assisted living facility abruptly cut Charlotte's hours due to budget constraints. She lost half her shifts. Meanwhile, Ethan's contract painting job ended earlier than expected. The next rent payment loomed, and they discovered they were $200 short. Desperate, Charlotte called Neil Dawson's office, explaining the situation politely. She requested an extra week, promising she'd gather the money as soon as her next paycheck arrived. In times past, old Howard might have understood, but she had no sense of Neil's temperament. The conversation was brief. Neil's assistant referred her to the contract's terms, reminding her of late fees. No extension was granted. Charlotte hung up feeling an ache in her chest. After fruitlessly searching for a small loan from friends, most of them in similarly tight conditions, Charlotte and Ethan ended up 4 days late on the rent. On the 5th day, a notice appeared pinned to their door: pay rent or vacate in 3 days. The bold letters made Charlotte's heart pound. They'd never seen anything so threatening. On the phone again, Charlotte pleaded with Neil's office, but the response was a cold recitation of the lease's clauses. She hung up in tears, telling Ethan there was no leniency. They had 72 hours, or they'd face eviction. In a frantic scramble, Ethan visited local contractors, seeking any job that would pay quickly. Charlotte borrowed a bit from a coworker. By the final day, they mustered almost all of what they owed, just $20 short. She called Neil's office again, explaining they nearly had the full sum, just a small shortfall, requesting more time for the remaining. Neil picked up personally this time, his tone icy. "I'm not running a charity. My father left me properties that are severely undervalued. If you can't pay, you leave. That's the deal." Charlotte couldn't hold back tears. "We have 2 children. We're only short by $20. We can get it in a day or 2. Silence on the line. Then Neil said something about not wanting partial payments. "I need the full sum. If it's not here by tomorrow, an eviction notice stands." He hung up. True to his word, the next day, a legal notice was posted. The Morrows faced eviction proceedings. For them, it was devastating. The meager money they'd scraped together went to immediate bills, leaving them short for any new security deposit at another place. The eviction process, though not instantaneous, moved swiftly under Neil's push. He insisted his local attorneys handle it aggressively, wanting no delays. "I want them out by the end of the month," he told the lawyer. "I'll renovate that unit, maybe double the rent for new tenants." Word spread quietly among neighbors that the Morrows were in trouble. A few tried to rally help. The local pastor collected some donations, but the time frame was so tight that by the time they had enough, the sheriff's office had already scheduled a date to enforce the eviction. Charlotte and Ethan, exhausted and humiliated, started packing what little they owned into boxes. Katie cried at night, worried about where they'd sleep. Thomas, too young to fully understand, clung to an old teddy bear, picking up on the tension swirling around him. On the morning the sheriff's deputies arrived, Charlotte stood in the living room, arms around her children, tears in her eyes. Ethan negotiated calmly, but the deputies, apologetic though they were, had to do their jobs. They gave the Morrows a short window to vacate. Neil Dawson himself pulled up in a sleek sedan, stepping out in a crisp jacket. He hovered near the curb, arms folded, supervising from a distance with a dispassionate gaze. The finality of it struck Ethan. He marched over to Neil, setting aside pride to beg for a final extension. "Just 1 more week, Mr. Dawson. We've raised the money, some from a neighbor's donation. We can pay. Please." Neil's expression didn't soften. "I gave you all the warnings. The time's up. Sorry, but business is business." He glanced at the battered car loaded with the family's boxes. You can't keep occupying property if you're behind on rent. That's the law. A flush crept over Ethan's cheeks. We tried everything. We're not freeloaders. My kids, Neil cut him off with a dismissive gesture. Spare me des sob story. Maybe next time, manage your finances better. He turned away, heading back to speak with one of the deputies. A dull humiliation stabbed Ethan. He realized it was over. They had no legal recourse. The Morrows were forced to drive off, boxes in the trunk, tears glistening in Charlotte's eyes. They spent that first night sleeping in the car behind a gas station, uncertain of tomorrow. Within days, Neil had a contractor come to measure the unit. His plan was to do a quick remodel, fresh paint, updated fixtures, and relist at a higher price. He bragged to colleagues about eliminating dead weight from his inherited properties. Some of them, more morally conscious, felt uncomfortable but kept quiet. Meanwhile, the Morrows drifted in a precarious limbo, short-term motel rooms when they could scrape up the cash, sometimes sleeping in the car. Katie's teacher noticed she was absent from school. Charlotte explained by phone that they were between addresses. The family's spirit sank to new lows. They had to put most of their possessions in cheap storage. Each day, Charlotte watched the children's heartbreak intensify. She felt consumed by guilt at failing to provide stability. But adversity sometimes fosters resilience. With quiet determination, Charlotte began calling local social services, desperate for housing help. They found a transitional shelter that gave them a small room for a few weeks. It wasn't ideal, cramped, with shared bathrooms, but at least it was a roof. She also discovered a new assisted living center opening in a neighboring town, which needed more aides. She interviewed, got hired, and started full-time hours. The pay was slightly better, offering hope of eventually saving for a new rental deposit. Meanwhile, Ethan found a stable painting job for a remodeling company. Over time, their finances stabilized. They tried to patch up the emotional toll on the kids. The memory of being physically removed from their home left a scar, but the Morrows vowed to rebuild. Time rolled on, about 3 months after the eviction. Neil completed the minor renovations on the Maplewood Lane duplex, listing the newly refreshed unit online for nearly double the old rent. The local market wasn't booming, but he reasoned if he held out, he'd snag a higher-paying tenant. Sure enough, a young professional couple showed interest. They had decent incomes, making them prime tenants, though they had no immediate move-in date. Neil was content to wait. During that interim, cracks began to appear in Neil's broader business. He'd expanded his real estate holdings aggressively, financed by short-term loans. A few months prior, a new city ordinance had shifted property tax rates for non-owner-occupied homes, raising Neil's obligations. Also, repairs at another property cost more than expected after an electrical problem. Worst of all, a large commercial tenant in one of Neil's small office buildings declared bankruptcy, leaving him with months of unpaid rent and a mortgage looming. Neil juggled loans, but interest rates ticked up. Suddenly, his once rosy cash flow turned precarious. Emails from lenders demanded urgent payments. Stress shadowed him. At first, Neil dismissed these problems as temporary. He believed he'd soon fill the vacant units at top dollar. But the economy in Brookside was soft. Some prospective renters balked at his high rent. That newly renovated Maplewood unit remained empty longer than he'd hoped. The professional couple who'd shown interest got cold feet after seeing cheaper options elsewhere. Meanwhile, Neil's mortgage bills arrived relentlessly. He realized, to his horror, that he was hemorrhaging money monthly with vacant units and mounting maintenance costs. The banks sent warning letters. Desperation seized him. He tried to shuffle funds from one property's rent to cover another's mortgage, but it wasn't enough. He applied for a refinancing package, only to be denied because his debt-to-income ratio soared. The once smug landlord found himself in late-night panic, scanning spreadsheets that refused to balance. He cut corners on property upkeep, letting small repairs languish. Tenants at other buildings grew disgruntled, some threatening to withhold rent until issues were addressed. Neil lacked the funds to fix everything. A downward spiral began. One day, a letter arrived from the county. Delinquent property taxes threatened a lien on one of his buildings. Furious, Neil called the tax office, but they insisted the bills had been sent months ago. He discovered a backlog of unopened mail in his cluttered office. Amid that mess, he found notices of legal action from a lender. A wave of dread crashed over him. He might lose multiple properties if he couldn't pay. As the crisis deepened, Neil's attitude grew bitter. He refused to lower rents or accept partial payments. He believed he just needed that perfect tenant or a quick property sale to bail him out. But in a slow real estate market, he found no buyers at the inflated prices he demanded. Some realtors advised him to reduce the asking price, but his pride refused. He'd once bragged to colleagues about these properties being gold mines. Accepting a lower price felt like defeat. Meanwhile, interest accrued. Lawyers for the mortgage company advanced toward foreclosure on at least one of his bigger assets. During this meltdown, the Maplewood Lane duplex sat half empty, the Morrow's old unit. The other half had a reliable tenant, Mr. Navarro, who paid modest rent on time. But Neil had hiked the Morrow side's rent so high that no one bit. Over the weeks, the vacant unit deteriorated. A small leak in the roof spread, warping the newly installed paint job. Neil delayed repairs, citing no funds. The rotting smell grew. Potential tenants who came by quickly lost interest upon seeing water stains. Neil grew more frantic. One overcast morning, as Neil paced in his office, phone pressed to his ear, he argued with a bank representative. They demanded immediate payment, or they'd proceed with foreclosure on the building housing half his commercial tenants. The conversation ended with him slamming the phone down, heart pounding. He was on the brink of losing everything. Cursing under his breath, he rummaged for anything he could liquidate. He realized if he sold some properties at a bargain, maybe he could settle debts. But the best candidate for a quick sale was ironically the Maplewood Lane duplex. The property was well located, but with the water damage, it needed repairs. That would lower its value. In a swirl of desperation, he decided to list it as is, hoping someone would buy it quickly enough to stave off foreclosure. To his frustration, weeks passed with no serious offers. The local real estate agent told him the water damage was scaring buyers and that the price was still too high. He might have to slash it significantly. Each day, bills stacked up. Neil sank deeper into dread. He even considered reaching out to old contacts or family for a loan, but no one wanted to rescue him from a self-inflicted predicament. He recalled how proudly he told acquaintances, "I'm unstoppable in real estate." Now, he was unstoppable only in the sense of plummeting downward. Meanwhile, the Morrows, though still living frugally, were gradually stabilizing. Charlotte's new job provided a steadier income than her old partial shifts. Ethan's painting gig turned into a longer-term position as the remodeling company landed more projects. They saved enough to get their own small apartment in the next town, near Charlotte's workplace. The children re-enrolled in a better school district. Though the scars of eviction lingered, they found solace in the fact they overcame a dire situation together. Charlotte sometimes thought about the callous landlord who'd tossed them out. She wondered if he slept well at night. She tried not to dwell on bitterness, focusing on moving forward for the kids' sake. Karma, however, had its own schedule. A few months after the Morrow's eviction, the bank foreclosed on Neil's largest office building. That was the final blow. Once he lost that stream of rent, the rest of his empire began to collapse. Lawsuits sprouted like weeds, contractors who hadn't been paid, banks claiming breach of contract. He discovered that the Maplewood Lane duplex was also in danger because he'd used it as collateral for another loan. The day a foreclosure notice arrived for that property, ironically, was the same day he realized he was nearly bankrupt. The meltdown was complete. Facing foreclosure, Neil scrambled to do a short sale of the duplex, hoping to repay a fraction of the loan. The bank demanded he vacate the building by a certain date so they could prepare for repossession. The entire fiasco mirrored the eviction he'd inflicted on others, but now he was on the receiving end. He tried negotiating with the bank, but they refused. He was in default. If he couldn't repay, they'd seize the property and auction it. The memory of telling the Morrow family business is business came back to haunt him. As the final days ticked by, Neil found himself in a humiliating position. He had no funds to rent a nice place. He wound up in a cheap motel, possessions crammed into a few boxes, the rest seized or liquidated. The bank's attorneys hammered him for the balance on multiple properties, and he faced personal liability lawsuits. The press of it was suffocating. He lay awake nights, recalling how he'd callously told Charlotte, "Spare me the sob story." Now he was living a sob story of his own creation. Eventually, the Maplewood Lane duplex went up for public auction after foreclosure. Potential bidders milled around the county steps. Among them, ironically, was the Morrows' new landlord, an older man with a small portfolio of rentals, known for being fair. He heard the property might sell cheaply. Charlotte and Ethan, though not flush with cash themselves, had grown friendly with this man, Mr. Garcia, who admired their grit. Mr. Garcia recognized the address, recalled the Morrow story. He decided to place a bid if it was a good deal, thinking maybe he could fix the place and rent it out fairly. At the auction, Neil was present, slumped against a wall, eyes hollow. The bidding started low. Mr. Garcia jumped in, along with a couple of other speculators. The price inched up, nowhere near what Neil once demanded. In the end, Mr. Garcia won the bid at a fraction of Neil's original listing. The property was legally transferred. Neil, humiliated, left the scene without so much as a handshake. He realized he'd lost everything. The local newspaper ran a small item on the auction, mentioning how a once proud landlord lost his properties due to foreclosure, highlighting the tenuous economy. In the background, some neighbors in Brookside recalled how Neil had swiftly evicted families, including the Morrows. They shook their heads at the irony. Mr. Garcia promptly assessed the property's condition. The roof leak had grown severe, damaging walls. It required a sizable investment to fix, but with the purchase price so low, Garcia could still recoup costs. He hired contractors to do a thorough renovation. A few weeks into the project, he chatted with Charlotte and Ethan, telling them he planned to create 2 pleasant units, possibly renting to stable families. Charlotte listened with mild interest, but their own lives were stable now in the new apartment. They were just curious about the fate of their old home. One day, out of curiosity, Charlotte drove by Maplewood Lane, seeing construction trucks out front. The duplex was draped in scaffolding, roofers busy overhead. She felt a pang of memories, Katie and Thomas playing in that small yard, the heartbreak of being forced out. But she also felt relief that it was in better hands now. She heard from Mr. Garcia that the planned rent wouldn't be exorbitant. He believed in fair housing. She allowed herself a bittersweet smile, imagining new families living there without the fear of sudden eviction. Meanwhile, Neil tried to piece together a living. He crashed on a friend's couch for a while, but that arrangement wore thin. His credit was ruined by defaulted loans. Potential employers saw his meltdown as a red flag. He was once self-employed, but references were poor. He faced accusations of mismanaging properties, letting them fall into disrepair. Some acquaintances he'd scorned refused to help. In a last resort, he took a low-level sales job at a used car dealership. It paid meager commissions, nowhere near his old lifestyle. His old suits began to look worn. He, ironically, found it hard to pay rent on a modest studio. He'd quietly become the type of tenant he once despised, struggling to make ends meet, behind on bills, forced to weigh which expense to pay first. In those humbling months, Neil's perspective shifted. He developed an uneasy empathy for families on the financial edge. He recalled how he told the Morrows to manage finances better, now realizing how fragile finances could be, especially when unexpected hurdles arise. He recognized that if someone came to him in crisis, the decent response was compassion, not immediate eviction. But regrets hardly changed his reality. By the end of the year, he was essentially broke, adrift in a small, grimy apartment on the other side of Brookside, the landlord ironically suspicious of his late payments. In a cosmic twist, he was close to being evicted himself. Back in the Morrow's world, progress continued. Charlotte was praised at her job for her gentle care of elderly residents. She earned a promotion and a small raise. Ethan's painting skills impressed his supervisor, so he got more consistent hours. With combined incomes, they saved enough for a deposit on a townhouse in a nicer neighborhood. Katie and Thomas adapted well to their new school, making friends. Their sense of stability had returned, though memories of that eviction day lingered. Occasionally, they'd drive by Maplewood Lane, noticing the revitalized duplex, its fresh coat of paint shining. They were grateful for how far they'd come. Months after the Morrows moved into their townhouse, Charlotte received an unexpected phone call from Ms. Jansen, the pastor's wife who once tried to help them with rent. Ms. Jansen explained that the old landlord, Neil Dawson, had approached the church seeking short-term assistance. He'd been behind on rent at his new place, was on the verge of eviction. Ms. Jansen had heard the name Neil Dawson before through the Morrow story. She wondered if Charlotte wanted to weigh in or pass a message. Charlotte felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, righteous anger, pity, a desire for closure. But mostly, she felt empathy. After discussing with Ethan, Charlotte agreed to meet Ms. Jansen at the church to see if she could glean more about Neil's situation. She wasn't sure if she wanted to confront him, but a part of her was curious to see him face to face, to see how karma had indeed spun its web. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at the church's small office. Charlotte arrived, her heart pounding. To her surprise, she found Neil outside, leaning against the church's brick wall, shoulders slumped. He recognized her instantly, his eyes wide with shame. She approached cautiously. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence. Ms. Jansen watched from inside, giving them space. Neil spoke first, voice raspy. "Charlotte, I didn't realize you'd be coming." She exhaled shakily. "Ms. Jansen said you were in a tough spot, needing help from the church. She hesitated, tears stinging her eyes as old hurt resurfaced. "I guess I wanted to understand how this happened." He stared at the ground. "I lost everything. The properties, the office building, the duplex. Debt piled up. I'm behind on my own rent now. The landlord gave me a notice. I came to the church, thinking maybe they had a rental assistance fund." His voice cracked. "It's humiliating, but I have no one else." Charlotte felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She recalled her children crying the day they were forced out, their boxes stacked on the curb. She recalled his dismissive voice on the phone. Yet here he was, a broken man, living the very fate he inflicted. She breathed deeply, trying to maintain composure. "So you see now what it's like?" His eyes flickered with guilt. "I do. I was so focused on profit, I forgot people's struggles. You must hate me. I don't blame you. I was arrogant, cruel even." He paused, trembling. "I'm sorry." That last phrase caught her off guard. She'd waited so long to hear it. A part of her expected to relish his downfall, but the reality was more complex. She studied him. Hollow cheeks, rumpled clothes, a desperation in his eyes. This was no triumphant moment. She felt pity more than satisfaction. She thought of her own children, how they'd needed compassion, and realized that maybe now was the time to show the same compassion he once denied her. Gently, she said, "You don't need me to forgive you for your life to turn around. That's something you must do for yourself. But for what it's worth, I do forgive you. Not because it was easy, but because holding on to anger is toxic." Tears welled in her eyes. "I hope you learned something from all this. That families who struggle, they're not leeches or criminals. They're just people doing their best." Neil swallowed hard. "I have learned. The worst way possible, but I have." She nodded, wiping her cheeks. Ms. Jansen emerged from the door, stepping gently onto the sidewalk. She asked quietly if everything was okay. Charlotte offered a faint smile, turning to Ms. Jansen. "He deserves a chance if we can help." I know how devastating eviction can be. Ms. Jansen nodded, compassion shining in her eyes. We have a small emergency fund. We might cover part of his arrears. If he can find a new place or a smaller room somewhere, maybe the church can help him get on his feet. She looked at Neil. But it won't be permanent. You need a plan. Neil nodded, lips quivering. Thank you. I'll do anything at this point, even a small shared apartment. I just want to avoid being on the street. Charlotte studied him. The temptation to say, now you know how we felt, was strong. But she simply said, good luck. If you truly regret what happened, pay it forward when you're stable again. He nodded wordlessly. They parted ways. Charlotte returned to her car, tears drying on her cheeks. A sense of closure settled over her. That old wound was finally sealed. In the weeks that followed, Ms. Jansen confirmed that the church assisted Neil with partial back rent and connected him to a job lead from another congregation member who ran a small accounting firm. Neil took that job, humbly starting as a data entry clerk. He rented a cheap bedroom in a shared house. For the first time, he tasted the precarious life of those living paycheck to paycheck. Yet he carried a deep sense of relief that he wasn't on the street. As months rolled on, the Morrows thrived in their new townhouse. The children settled happily, their laughter filling the cozy space. Charlotte's job progressed well, and Ethan even started a small side business in painting. They didn't become wealthy overnight, but they found stability, free from the shadow of a ruthless landlord. Sometimes Charlotte dreamt of owning a home, but for now, renting from a decent landlord was enough. She'd pass by Maplewood Lane occasionally, seeing families happily occupying the now well-maintained duplex. The old days felt far behind her. Meanwhile, Neil in his new job gradually saved some money, living frugally. He developed an empathy for coworkers who struggled, surprising them with how supportive he was. If someone needed a shift covered or was short on bus fare, he'd quietly help. Word spread that Neil, once known as a harsh landlord, had changed. He never openly broadcast his guilt, but he did mention once at a staff lunch that he'd made mistakes in real estate. One colleague teased him for living in a shared house, but he swallowed his pride, acknowledging that life had taught him humility. Over time, he regained a semblance of stability, though not the wealthy status he'd once boasted about. He found modest contentment in an honest paycheck, no longer consumed by greed. A year after losing Maplewood Lane, he drove by the property out of curiosity, seeing the families in the yard, kids playing. The building looked cheerful with bright paint. He felt a pang, a swirl of regret and acceptance. He realized those people were safe there, paying rent to a compassionate landlord, and he didn't belong in that story anymore. Karma had indeed struck him hard, but it wasn't purely vengeful. It taught him a lesson. He recognized that if he'd been more lenient or human with tenants like the Morrows, he might have built a stable, respectable business. Instead, he fueled his own downfall. Now, ironically, he was forging a new path with humility, reliant on the kindness of people he once dismissed. The final turn of events came 2 years after the Morrows' eviction. Charlotte, now with a stable record of rent payments and improved finances, visited a local bank to inquire about mortgage options. They considered a small, modest house that had come on the market. It was in a decent neighborhood near the kids' schools. The bank officer recognized how the Morrows' credit had improved thanks to consistent bills payment. They qualified for a first-time homebuyer program with a manageable down payment. Overjoyed, Charlotte and Ethan placed an offer on the little house, praying it would go through. The day the offer was accepted, Charlotte called Ethan with tears of happiness. "We're going to own a home," she whispered, hardly believing the words. Katie and Thomas squealed in delight. They'd have their own yard, no fear of being forced out. The memory of that eviction was overshadowed by a new beginning. The cycle had turned. They'd soared from the darkest low to a place of hope. On move-in day, neighbors arrived with small housewarming gifts. Charlotte stood on the porch, gazing at the yard, heart brimming with gratitude. Meanwhile, back in a modest boarding house, Neil Dawson quietly ate a microwave dinner. He wasn't miserable, but life was simpler, narrower. He'd learned not to measure success in money alone. He never saw the Morrows again, but if he had, maybe he would congratulate them. Perhaps he'd even apologize once more. That chapter was behind them all, but the lesson endured. The cruelty of evicting a struggling family had come back around, upending his own fortunes. In its wake, both sides found new perspectives, forging empathy or resilience. And so, the moral settled. Greed can blind one to others' humanity, but fate or karma eventually rebalances. The Morrows lost their home, but gained renewed determination to rebuild. Neil lost his empire, but gained a late lesson in compassion. The ripples of that eviction day changed them all. The sun rose on Brookside each morning, shining over families who faced hardships but still managed to help each other. A quiet testament that no one is inherently above or below receiving kindness or the bite of justice, depending on how they treat those in need.